रेशमा, इसको इधर लगा दे यार प्लीज, वो कमरे में थोड़ा अच्छा ये रिसेप्शन होगा।
Hi, ma'am.
Hello.
Good evening. Am I audible?
Anukriti, just speak a little louder.
Am I audible now?
Yeah.
So it's asking me to click a tile at the bottom. Where is that? Do I need to click something?
Anukriti, no, nothing.
You are perfectly audible and we can see you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So hello, both of you. I saw you at, the last event. Hi, Vasanti.
Yeah, hi Kumkum, nice to see you.
Yeah, it's nice. I'm trying to, find my pieces of paper.
And on a personal note, I would like to mention that both of us, Prakriti and I, we were a part of your course exactly a decade ago in Ambedkar University. We were pursuing MA in Gender Studies.
In AUD?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, you were both in AUD. Oh my God.
Yes.
God.
Story, events, structure. You were a part of that course.
Oh, actually, strange. I'm talking about structural violence today.
Yes.
I don't know why, but it's sort of coming back to me as a. What has been the intergenerational content of your series? I'm curious.
So we decided to start a conversation between scholars of different generations, how they look at the same questions, and but with some tensions and differences which are there. Can we start a conversation on those? So the main purpose was to bring all of that together and not to divide at all. But yeah.
Okay. But that class, that AUD class, was great fun for me.
Yes.
I really enjoyed it. I don't know about the rest of the class really, and but it was lovely.
We enjoyed it too. It was good. Yes.
Fun. Yeah.
Vasanti ma'am, hello. Welcome to the meeting. Welcome to the lecture. Yes, I'm Anukriti. I'm teaching in School of Gender Studies, Mahatma Gandhi University in Kerala.
Okay, yes, I think
Prakriti was
Hello, Kriti.
Anukriti. Prakriti and I are batchmates.
yes,
We were together in AUD.
Okay, and where are you teaching, Prakriti?
Ma'am, I'm with the Muslim Women's Forum.
Acha.
Yeah.
And that's now quite old, right? 10, 15 years or so.
26 years.
No, it's more than that.
I'm losing track of time. It's going so fast. So we're all set, and let me just check what I have a turn off microphone, turn off camera, which I'll do for a minute so that I don't run out of battery. Na? How much time do we have left for?
5 to 6
We
minutes.
have 5 to 6 minutes.
So I'll just switch this off for 5 minutes. Is that
Yes.
okay?
Yes, yes, yeah, yeah.
रेशमा को पानी दे दे यार, ये ना थोड़ा पीने का पानी बॉटल।
a very warm welcome to all those who have joined so far. Let's wait for 5 more minutes. After 5 minutes, we can start the session. Good evening. Good evening to one and all present here. It's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Kumkum Sangari for today's online lecture titled Some Questions on Structural Violence. Professor Sangari is one of the most distinguished scholars in the fields of feminist theory, cultural studies, and social history. Her work has profoundly shaped critical conversations on gender, culture, and power in South Asia and beyond. On a personal note, and I have to mention it, it's a special privilege for me to introduce her today. Nearly a decade ago, in 2016, during my MA at Ambedkar University, Delhi, when I was pursuing MA in Gender Studies, and Prakriti, who is a researcher at MWF, she is also present with us today. We were batchmates, and we were taught by her. The name of the course is Event Story Structure. Her teaching left a lasting impression on many of us. Professor Kumkum Sangari is the William F. Vilas Research Professor of English and the Humanities at the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee. She has been a professorial fellow at the Center for Contemporary Studies, Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, New Delhi, a visiting fellow at Yale University, Delhi University, Jadavpur University, and a visiting professor at the University of Chicago, Central European University, University of London, University of Erfurt, and Ambedkar University. She is the author of Solid Liquid, a transnational reproductive formation, published by Columbia University Press in 2015, and Politics of the Possible, Essays on Gender, History, Narratives, Colonial English, also published by Columbia University Press in 1999. She has co-edited several books, including the Path-Breaking Collection, Recasting Women, Essays in Colonial History, and most recently, Arcs and Dive, the works of Shiba Chachi and Trace Retrace, Paintings Nilima Sheikh. On behalf of everyone present here, I extend a warm welcome to Professor Sangari, and I would like to thank her for taking the time to share her insights with us. Professor Sangari, we are honored to have you. The floor is all yours.
Okay, thank you so much for your invitation and your kind introductions and your help in helping me to learn how to use Google Meet. So the title of my talk today is Visible, Invisible, Small Questions on Structural Violence. I mean, structural violence is such a huge subject that in all we know, one has to practice total modesty here. It's something that I have just recently wanted to think about again. And I think one of the reasons for that is actually intergenerational. So much has changed, there is the consciousness of young people has changed so much in 40 years or more, actually maybe since the 1970s, so more like 50 years. But at the same time, the material structures have not kept pace with that. So we actually have a daily contradiction and tension between what things could be and what they are not. So my sense of it is that, maybe we want to think about the women's movement and not like a debit credit sheet at all, but thinking that the women's movement has been constantly confronted by the specter of the continuity of patriarchal and other malpractices. I mean, why are we still at the same place when things like rape are concerned? Why are we at the same place? Sometimes at a worse place even. So I was thinking that maybe we want to think about structures of violence once more. Structures of violence can be geopolitical, and I think to our despair, we know that is so much the current scenario right now. They can be micro-social, tiny, from home to home. And in some sense, they enforce social reproduction in different parts of the world, and not in exactly the same way, but sometimes to the same effect. So the microsocial and the geopolitical are both marked by repetition. And I think repetition is one of the signs of structure. Structure wouldn't be structure if it was not being constantly reproduced and repeated in different ways. Structures can also, violence can, in common perception, just seen as bad luck, kismat, destinal, inexorable. And it's precisely this that I want to address today and shift, because I think this is actually an intergenerational task. This is a way of looking back and to the future and dealing with the present as well. Structures of violence can roll across, time and place. They are difficult to dislodge, hard to interrupt. But I think that's what, that knotty place is where I want to go today. This spatial spread and temporality of violence, structures of violence, raises a question about the definition of culture, which is especially important, I think, in countries which used to be called Third World. Paul Farmer, actually an American anthropologist, focuses on structural violence and suffering in Haiti, and shows how social forces ranging from poverty to racism become embodied as individual experiences and push women into sex work and venereal disease and early deaths, early mortality from lack of any real medical care. Significantly, he refuses to confuse structural violence with cultural difference. And in a sentence I love very much, he says that we cannot confuse structural violence with cultural difference or poverty with otherness, and says that the concept of culture should have an increasingly limited role in explaining the distribution of misery. And I mean, in that sense, I have a feeling that, here we are at a point where, of course, there is the ubiquity of structural violence. But, without erasing that ubiquity and the context, there is a way of saying this can be seen differently. Du Saraswati is a poet, a theatre person, and part of the Dalit movement. She is an activist among contract workers and street sweepers. Born in a middle-class family in Bangalore, she did not personally suffer caste oppression, but her father, the son of a village leather worker, did suffer that. Her short story called Tip was written in Kannada and translated into English. It's a remarkable story that works through the stigmatized existence, constitutive social exclusion, and poverty that characterize many Dalit lives. Dalits undertake necessary productive and social reproductive labor. The events in this story are wrapped in this dailiness. One just pause here to ask, does the duration of structural violence itself imply a slow and grinding dailiness? In Tip, the main protagonist, Anji Amma, works for Swachh Bengaluru, clearing the wilderness for the development of new residential areas in Bangalore, with the promise of Bengaluru, with the promise of a permanent job. Till now, she has been denied this job and has only been getting temporary contracts. She's not servile, but exclusion is used to punish her for her outspokenness and her just demands as a worker. Interestingly, the absence of dominant men in her family is striking. The family is poor, unpropertied. Her husband and son-in-law are both insecure wage workers who have to find coolie work on tiny wages every day. So the patriarchal structuration of men and women is dispersed. It is shared between discrimination against Dalits, uh, the municipal corporation, subcontractors, the medical establishment, the inheritance of generational lack and social disrespect, and hereditary caste-based labor. Amma is in urgent need of a surgery for her constantly weeping eyes, but she cannot find the time or lose a day's wages. The child born to her daughter has only 2 fingers. The daughter, poignantly, sees this as presaging a future escape from manual menial labor. At least he won't have to do that kind of work, she says. The story circles around food, so desired by Amma's pregnant daughter, and her husband goes to great lengths to purchase the ingredients and cook a modest mutton curry. In a context of scarcity and scavenging, the act of cooking and serving is joyful. But Amma has cleared the corpse of a dead animal and cannot swallow a single morsel. She is unable to eat because she connects food and the manual removal of dead animals. Can she, or a worker like her, re-signify this hazardous, polluted, and dangerous work? As long as there is dirt, somebody, it seems, must embody it. Dirt seems to be a kind of symbolic assignment. Are the dirty those who produce dirt or those who remove dirt? I think this is a question we have yet to openly address and answer. Must she who cleans also contain and absorb dirt? I think what these stories and the fieldwork of Paul Farmer shows, the complex historical and contemporary streams that flow into structural violence. The imbrication of a structure in other structures makes voluntarist notions of self-transformation empty. I've recently been introduced to Instagram and those little reels, which come for half a minute, which are telling you how to remake your body, how to remake your psychology, how to throw toxic people out of your lives, how to be totally autonomous and self-reliant. I mean, this voluntary notion of self-reliant is empty. It is simply a social media version of makeovers. Farmer points out that violence can be systematic if its various forms reinforce each other. The systematic nature can build a chain of successive acts and events. Farmer's depiction of structural violence, dispossession from land and livelihood, sexual exploitation, environmental degradation, which dispossesses people from their ancestral lands, or at least the lands where they have resided for a while, and recourse to sex work. This entire depiction is a very close relative of Naomi Klein's sacrifice zones and what Etienne Balibar terms death zones, which shape daily life and create situations of extreme violence that alter gender relations. At one level, structural violence is understood and contained by a common sense understanding of visible resource depletion. Things like pollution, climate change, the expropriation of land, the destruction of subsistence agriculture, and environments, forests, food security. We all know this so well. The spread of toxic waste, the privatization of common property, endless wars, and other forms of extractivism. We live with this, we know this, we resist it. there are sharp recognitions and resistances of the structural armature of communal, racist, and patriarchal violence in South Asia and India especially. But why do they not allow sustained organized resistance? When there is so much resistance, why can it not be sustained and organized enough to actually, break these structures, to interrupt them? So in a way, there is opposition, but there is also a much larger persistence. And that's why I want to call, your attention to this. Because if this is a persistence that that was there at the start of the second phase of the women's movement, of which I was and am a part, then why is it still there after half a century? What's happening? Uh, Let me go back to the term itself. The term structural violence was coined by Johan Galtung, a Norwegian theorist, who saw this less as visible than direct violence, but more lethal and embedded in systems like law, economy, cultural norms that disadvantage certain groups, making it harder to identify a single perpetrator. He describes this as causing indirect or invisible violence because suffering arises from systemic issues, not a specific person's direct action. Now, it's a very persuasive thesis, but I do think that we need to think about it more. He wrote this in 1969. Galtung, by the way, was a Gandhian and wrote, very pioneering work on constructive peace. So he sees direct and intentional violence when someone comes with a dagger to kill you as different from structural violence where you fall dead without knowing what hit you. I mean, those are my words, not his. Structural violence for him is slow because it manifests in social inequalities. It can be physical, psychological, socio-political, and so on. And that deprive people of access to basic needs. But the consequences cannot be tracked back to a concrete person. And this is the mystifying part of, thinking about structural violence. So he does say that both direct and structural violence are interdependent forces. Both can cause suffering. Structural violence increases the latent potential for direct violence. Cultural violence for him is part of the symbolic sphere, and then he does separate out economic violence, social violence, gendered violence, and sexual violence, and so on. So the point here really is that he does say violence against women is structural, but then who is the perpetrator? And how come this structure has, continued to persist? So what remains curious, and this remains a popular construction of structural violence, so it's not, it didn't have a limited life. So what remains curious about these conceptions of structural violence, there is a clear recognition of multi-factor causality. I mean, they are very, open about all the things that actually go into this violence or cause it. But it seems to be a causality unaccompanied by direct agency or accompanied by an assumed lack of direct agency. There is no villain to catch by the corner, beat up at the corner of the street, kick to death and go away and say, I won. No. So amorphous, blurry, or invisible is the agent that it absolves most individuals from responsibility and resistance by naturalizing structures. This is the way things are, and it gives them a destinal and or inexorable character. We know this so clearly actually with the climate change deniers, right? So this visible, invisible character of structural violence has consequences. Structures are understood in my mind to denote collective and consolidated power. Have individual intentions and agential interventions just been absorbed into these, we can't find them anymore? Where is the chain of small or large profit, the individual, group, or corporate beneficiary? Supposedly non-agential structural violence may be another name for impunity. This is something I would like, us to consider. Whereas many kinds of violence are punitive and symbolic, structural violence is constitutive. When a number of hereditary, majoritarian, and contextual oppressions bundle together, fuse, and are repeated, then violence becomes constitutive. Is structural violence a concern related to class, caste, and communalism? Or is it also very deeply entwined in gender and in families? As I have written elsewhere at length, gendered violence swirls through intergenerational care, regulatory marriage, intercaste and interreligious marriages, the control of procreation through son selection, old age care, non-wage domestic labor, inheritance of property and other assets, debt servicing, distress migration, unequal access to social resources and space. Recently, a caste panchayat tried to ban the use of cell phones by women. Domestic violence works through class-lowering mechanisms such as social boycott, eviction, threats of desertion and divorce, as well as physical violence. So gendered violence then becomes structural. Notice I say becomes, when family microviolence and public violence interpenetrate, even interlock in gender and caste identified labor. The dispossession, the disembedment, and the abandonment of women, all of these can be preludes to their destitution. Family, sexual, social, caste-based, communal, economic, public, political, and state violence comprise a circuit in which similar forms of violence take place inside and outside the family. In this circuit, families both absorb and radiate violence. So then what is misogyny? We talk a lot about misogyny these days, right? And the increase in misogyny and whatever. Is misogyny an effect or consequence of structural violence, or does it predate and precede it? Since we live in, since we are, familiar with India and its history and its mythology, it's very hard to say that it is just something that arose in modern times, right? There's enough misogyny which goes back deep into our old narratives. But how should misogyny be positioned in the present? It has long histories in many parts of the world, but now there is a definite increase in quantity and quality of the social circulation of misogyny. I mean, in an era of militarization, economic dependency, and authoritarian governments, there is a visible growth in anti-patriarchal or feminist consciousness and resistance, and an equally visible growth in women's consent and anti-feminist engines of repression and backlash. The cruelty of a number of right-wing women is more than an expression of consent. And I say this advisedly, the cruelty of right-wing women. We're seeing this everywhere. We are seeing this in the US, we are seeing this in Poland. Don't ask me to limit the number of places we are actually seeing it in. So it seems to be a bid for personal safety and political power, a move from agreeing to, just agreeing to be subservient to patriarchal power to active agency in exercising patriarchal power. Women are politically divided today as never before. Perhaps these expressions of agency are not quite the kind of empowerment that synchronizes with just professional success or neoliberal capital. Rather, the agents themselves emerge from structures and replicate them, or even perhaps extend their power. So they have repressive and divisive functions. They confer patriarchal power. They also function as a concomitant enlargement of consent. And this consent is a readiness to police and patrol other women and men and exclude them as part of a wider consent to current caste, religious, economic, state, and patriarchal regimes. What is more, it positions some women as simultaneously victims and oppressors. And I cannot stress this enough. We have not had quite this combination of victimage and oppression in the hands of women as today. Not quite. This deep ambiguity has emerged from very distinct histories in different countries and now coincides ironically with the rhetoric of geopolitics. This rhetoric says, or rather, this is a rhetoric in which victims claim, and the victim claims of powerful majorities, have become routine. So to return to the relation between misogyny and structural violence, the social and historical depth and permeation of misogyny is pervasive. Misogyny is attitudinal and also actionable. It is froth and sediment. It devalues women, claims that all women are bad, all bad women are the same, all women are the same, etc. We know all that. Such devaluation seems to function as a guarantee of ownership and control, while something happened, my screen changed. Seems to function as a guarantee of ownership and control, while the depersonalization of women accentuates male rights to hurt, desert, dispossess. This also alters the notion of structural violence as being only indirect violence. Rather, direct violence and visible male and female actors can be entangled in structural violence at many levels. Jayati Ghosh has argued, very pertinently, that the use of patriarchal social relations has become fundamental to the accumulation process itself, which actually requires the continuing impoverishment of certain sections for its very success. To complicate matters more, which I will proceed to do, patriarchal violence is not a segregated species of violent acts. It cannot be put into a separate compartment, which not only have we as feminists been sometimes guilty of, but not always, but certainly mainstream academics and public discourse like to put it in a separate compartment. Rather, patriarchal violence is at the hub of the normalization of violence for several reasons. The span of patriarchal violence is so wide, it cuts across class, the so-called divide between public and private, and what are construed as distinct social terrains. The dominant agencies of patriarchal violence stretch from inside the family to caste group, community organizations, and the state. These work both in isolation and intersection. Everyday gendered violence can and has become the site in which one kind of violence functions to normalize another kind, precisely because gendered violence is at one level a connective tissue. I repeat, a connective tissue between patriarchal systems and other social structures. It is the node at which inequalities represented by each of these dominant agencies meet and interact. In sum, what I'm suggesting is that we need to make a much more comprehensive theory of gendered violence, in relation to, what can one say, the totality of structures of violence. Anyway, but to move to a somewhat different key, which is not so bleak. Structures are not inert. Structuration is a continuous, renewing, changing, unresolved process which may be more negotiable at certain historical moments than at others. At one level, of course, structure is an analytic abstraction, a cognitive grid of a social terrain which is much more complex and dense than the sum of structures, which may be extrapolated from it. There may be in social practice inflections, asymmetries, densities, gaps, contradictions, ways of interpreting a range of actions and choices available to individuals, which cannot be mechanically read off from structures. We cannot do comic book cartoons from this. Nor perhaps should structures be seen as always prior to agency in a deterministic way. Some may be in place, others being evolved or displaced through the cumulative aggression or conscious collectivization of agencies. Equally important are the sites of underdetermination, the points at which agencies slip through structures in new situations, transitional moments, or in liminal areas. Individuals are not an externality to structures insofar that they absorb and enact them, insofar as they inhabit and maintain them. So somewhere then the splitting of, individual agency into some other pocket from structures might be misleading. Structural violence can politicize citizens, but it can also obstruct politicization by draining all time and energy into daily survival struggles. One of the great allies of the power of structural violence is survival economies, because that is where all energy and resources go in survival. And this depresses potentially transformative social agencies to becoming coping agencies, which are mired in the immediacy of destitution and displacement. Structure should be considered then in relation to context, conjuncture, and constellation. And it should be plucked out of this misleading conundrum of a non-agential, non-intentional force with visible effects. In other words, as a kind of destiny. It is transgenerational because the violence continues. What was there 50 years ago does, in some respects, not all, continue. And this continuity has to be understood before it can be interrupted. And I say this is an intergenerational task because it was begun, it continues, and has to continue with new understandings from younger generations. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sangari, for that brilliant talk. I would just like to now open the floor for Q&A if anyone has any questions.
I see a hand up.
joined-
Yeah, I see some hands up, so maybe one of you can
I
moderate.
joined the meeting a bit late. So, ma'am, what exactly do you mean by structures? I know it's a little bit of a dumb question to ask.
I think I'll repeat what I said during the talk. That might be clearer than I trying to do it all over again. One moment. I think I pointed out different ways of thinking about structures, but let me just, I can't find it here. But basically, I think where family and public violence, coincide, that creates a very powerful structure. When Khap Panchayat can sit and say women must not have cell phones, that is a moment where it's not just the Khap Panchayat which is exercising, power. It is a place where the families desire to control young women coincides with that of the Khap Panchayat, and together they become formidable. Or you can think of structure as that which is repetitive, which happens again and again. I mean, you remember those stories, for example, I remember them so well. The FIR plot, you know, women would go to the, who had been raped would go to the police station, try to register a FIR and fail. And in one case, there was a tribal woman who walked 122 miles to register an FIR of her daughter's rape. So that idea of just registering the rape meant that you were going against a structure which prohibited it. And what constituted this structure? It constituted, again, the power of police, patriarchal power being exercised in the family. After all, the rapist also has a family, So it's all these things which coincide and make structures. If you think about climate change, who's made that structure? It is a very powerful structure. It's destroying, many parts of the world, climate refugees, but it's here a product of amazing collusions, between the flabbiness of ordinary citizens and between the celerity of corporations, which are able to get even environment protection laws cancelled in so many countries now to guard their profits. And then the power of the narrative, which joins it, This has always happened before. There were always floods. You're being paranoid. Don't worry, etc., etc. So I'm not going through everything. If you see the Do Saraswati story, look at all the things that are coming there. Hunger and poverty. It's a subsistence, economy that they inhabit. And what do they do? What can they do? What should they do? How should they do it? Who should do it alongside, So it's, you have to think about structure in a way which is a structure which actually, in the case of the contemporary world, governs and determines poverty and hunger and all kinds of disability and inequality.
Okay, Professor, I would like to ask a question. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah. So yesterday, the Supreme Court rejected the paid menstrual leave on the grounds that women will not be hired if such a leave is made compulsory. So my question is whether this kind of ruling is the guise of possible shrinking of employment opportunities for women is not a disguised structural violence of discrimination in some way.
Yeah, I was reading that and I was slightly puzzled. If maternity leave is not, going to be seen as destroying women's job chances. I remember once when I was teaching in Hungary at the Central University, there were a lot of, students and faculty there who had actually been part of the Soviet regime, which collapsed in 1989. And one of the things that they were lamenting, interestingly, was that why were people from the West coming there to teach them about feminism? Because they already had, very good rights in that regard. In Hungary, women got 3 months of 3 years of maternity leave and could join back their jobs at the same level at which they left them. Now, and then they had creches and childcare and so on and so forth. So this idea that, somehow we had something, I'm not talking of we as me, but the world outside had something to teach them was absurd. Now, the point really is if maternity leave is not absurd, then what is wrong with menstrual leave, right? And should all women want menstrual leave, or those women who need it be given menstrual leave? I think that might be the question. Because sometimes I think some women do very well and don't actually suffer and have cramps and other kinds of pain, and some do very badly. So surely the ones who do badly have a right to get leave, and there should be some leave into which they can be slotted. And if that, and in any case, women are discriminated against in most laws and most professions. They get less money for the same work, etc., etc. So I think the court is being a little bit disingenuous,
Okay.
putting it mildly.
Anu Sunny, okay, there's one question, but Anu Sunny has raised his hand. So would you like to go ahead with your question?
Okay, thank you, ma'am. I'm Anusani. Actually, my name is Anuraj. I'm a trans person who is studying in School of Gender Studies, Mahatma Gandhi University. Right now, I am also participating for the PhD course in gender studies also. So, my ma'am, I'm a great fan of yours. Your academical works as politics of impossibles are very what it gives very consciousness to the students of gender studies, and also a religion and the possible what relevances of these multiple patriarchies are very exciting when we read it. Thank you for that kind of works. And my question is, I'm doing a PhD on legalizing the reproductive justice of queer people and non-binary people in modern world, or modern medical ways. So, but recently, yesterday, approximately on 12th March, we got a new ideology about the trans person through the bill of amendment of Transgender Justice Act, Protection Act. They had redefined us, or they had redefined us without any mercy. They killed our identity, they killed our consciousness, and they killed everything we had. They had questioned our self-proclamation right. They had questioned everything, and I'm an unbodied person who is sitting in this live right now. And how far I can how far I can go for my right when these kind of patriarchal things getting around me? How can I build this academic career, or how can I build my next motives for my rights with this kind of patriarchy? How can I escape from this, or how can I define me? Like people says that women are undefinable, every woman is different. So in this context, my question is to the academics, and my question is to everyone, is that as a trans person, or who is not representing the definitions of the politics or the government, how far the people can move on in the right?
No, Sunny, this is a very, difficult question to answer, because I think what is happening to, third gender, trans people, and not just in India, is a pushback. There's a big pushback, which is, fairly ideological in itself, because it wants to re-establish heterosexuality as the norm and heteropatriarchy as the norm. And I say re-established because it must be getting threatened, otherwise there wouldn't be this kind of pushback. So I think that the only way to work through this, and I have heard a couple of people talk about this seriously, is if one can think of passages between heterosexual feminism and trans rights, and they come together. They don't have to stand alone, either one. I don't think feminism is a much desired, position either, though it's not in the same danger as, third gender, trans, and alternative sexualities are right now. Secondly, I think one needs to have much clarity about how this is going to be anti-patriarchal. And this is also interesting because you see there has been tension between feminism and, trans workers for a long time. and the one seems to, some people think they are not compatible, other people have tried to make coalitions. But I think you can't protest as a single person beyond a point. There has to be, a collective, a coalition. And I think one can find that across the spectrum. It's not just about trans people. Anti-patriarchal is about all of us. So, what are the ways, what are the concepts which will bring you together, which will help you to move together, and which will protect, numbers will be protective. An individual in this scenario would be very, very vulnerable. Does that help at all?
Yes, ma'am, but it's a little bit confusion, and I suggest all the feminists who are in the live should take this matter as a reasonable one, uh, with all the other issues, and they will have to say something in their social platform or anything else, which they can do, and it is very really important for the trans matters. Thank you.
I think it's also a question of, there has to be a meeting ground. And the meeting ground can only be in anti-patriarchalisms. And anti-patriarchalisms have to be able to define themselves in ways where their interests are not different from those feminist and trans interests have a common ground. So I think this is a definitional battle, a battle of self-definition as well. It's not just an identity issue, it's more than that. The identity, of course, goes without saying.
Hello, ma'am. Am I audible? Hello?
Yes, yes. Dr. Sri Devi, you are
Yeah.
audible.
Yeah.
Go on.
Yes. My question is, in many cultural industries, including film industry, structural violence often become normalized through this, all you know that this patriarchal system. Especially, for instance, in Kerala, the findings of Hema Committee report exposed how gendered inequalities and exploitations are sustained through institutional practices. Even when individuals and collectives exercise agency to challenge these structures, the system attempt to neutralize or delegitimize that resistance, a kind of renormalizing the structural violence. So, how would you interrupt this cycle of system and um, like delegitimization of this resistance?
Your voice is disappearing a bit. Just say that last sentence again.
Yeah, like when an individual or a collective group like WCC or any collectives exercise an agency to challenge these structures, the system often attempt to neutralize or legitimate that resistance. So a kind of renormalizing structural violence. How do you interpret this cycle in which the structural violence is normalized within the cultural institution?
Yeah, yeah. No, that's a very important question. Uh, I think how does injustice get normalized? First of all, it depends on a strong narrative of constant repetition of untruths till the point that the untruth begins to seem like truth. And I think that strategy means that whoever gets control of the narrative quickly, fast, and through these methods is likely to come out as the dominant, force. So I think we have to always interrupt the narrative, always, with a counter narrative. And secondly, I think we have to expose the materiality of that structure. We have to point out, who is doing what, who owns what, who profits, who is in a position of control. We have to put these things out so that, they can't be hidden anymore. And I think that's another way. Now, exposure by itself is not enough because people have become pretty shameless now. They tell you what they're doing. They don't mind saying, I'm killing you and you can't get away. So I think we have to think that it's not just exposure alone, but analysis which counts. That is the one thing the social media and AI as yet cannot do the same way that we can. They can analyze things. We can analyze things. We can show where the contradictions are, where it can crack, and where it's stubborn. And we can bring out its full quality and materiality in our analysis. And that is a power we have. And I think it's worked in many, many cases over the years, that feminist analysis has become incontrovertible. You can't deny it. And then I think boycotts also work. If one can, but sometimes livelihood depends on things, so it's not such an easy thing. But historically, boycotts have worked. Sometimes this can still work.
Okay, Professor, we have a question by Professor Nishad Zaidi. She's asking, when it comes to structural violence, women have always been victims of it, not just at the receiving end, but also as perpetrators, to extend Faninian frame, which is also in a way a sign of victimhood. How is the current scenario and current structures different from the past?
Women have always been victims.
Women in which at the receiving end, but also as perpetrators, which is also in a way a sign of victimhood. So how is the current scenario and the current structures different from the past?
I think the social domain in which women acted it's important to take into account. I mean, women who were victims and perpetrators in the past, who were they? I mean, it's true that women are also a part of family violence, domestic violence. This was one of the most painful discoveries of feminists in second wave. During the second wave, when we were protesting things like dowry burnings and so on. So yes, women could even then be, perpetrators, and those women were themselves also victims. Now what I'm saying is that the situation is a little bit different, because to be a perpetrator and to claim that you're a victim has become a very common ploy, not just by women, but by majoritarian groups, by huge countries. There are countries right now who say, oh, they have been persecuted for 49 years or something by another country, things like that. So this fusing together of victimhood and, and oppression is a very complex maneuver, because it's not just a rhetorical maneuver, people are taking action on the basis of this doubleness. And I don't know what you mean by women have always, because I don't know how far back in history this is. In the second half of the 20th century and now, this has increased massively. I mean, now, for example, you have, women taking on postures of victimhood while exercising cruelty and other forms of, physical power. So what do we do about it? How do we, and it's not untrue. In some cases, women can be both. They can be victims as well as perpetrators. But then in some cases, there is a complete falseness to the claim of victimhood. So I think this has to be thought, through. When these claims are made by a group or a powerful group, when they are being made by somebody who's actually been, beaten or subject to violence, we have to go case by case, maybe. I don't think we can have, but what I can only say is that it has made things much more confusing and ambiguous.
Krishna Priya has raised her hand, so would you like to go next?
Good evening, ma'am. Ma'am, I'm Krishna Priya. I'm doing my fourth semester MA Gender Studies at Mahatma Gandhi University. So, what I'm about to ask is not more of a question, but rather a help from your side. So, actually, for my final year dissertation, I'm doing a project on the title Examination of the Scope and Limitations of Select Gender Related Acts and Policies in India. Shall I repeat it once again?
Yes.
Examining the scope and limitations of select gender related acts and policies in India. So,
Okay.
I'm planning to take up acts like the POSH Act, then Section 498A of IPC, and the Dowry Prohibition Act, and rest of the acts and policies I'm yet to finalize. So, basically, I'm covering the acts and policies regarding the domestic violence and sexual harassment and how it actually impacts marginalized women. So, I'm stressing on marginalized women as my subject, and like considering the intersectional factors like caste, class, disability, etc. And given your work on structure or your talk on structural violence, I would like to understand how my project question actually connects to this broader question of or the larger issue of structural violence.
I think you would need to look at each act and bill or that you're looking at or policy in this light. I don't think you should rush to a generalization before looking at each. For instance, the right to residence for women who are undergoing domestic violence was quite path-breaking, and it meant that they couldn't be thrown out of the house. And if the case was going to be one of divorce or separation, until that point they had the right to live, and then they also had the right to be given residence. Now that right to residence was a very, very great achievement on the part of the women's movement, but what it was used as was to to make out that women were misusing this law in order to get the right to live in their in-laws' house. And there was a lot of complaint, maybe it still continues, I haven't followed it for a while, from men and in-laws about this. Now, and if you go back even to the anti-sati, I mean any legislation, any progressive legislation, you will find that there have been ways people have spent a lot of time trying to find a loophole, complain about it, say it was unjust to women, to in-laws, unjust to men, unjust to the X, Y, and Z. So there is a element of constant conflict, within each one of them. And the conflict has to be seen in two ways. One is that it is internally conflicted by the people who are affected by those laws and policies. And secondly, that it represents an anti-feminist backlash that is all over society, and they are part of that. So one has to see how and here the structure that is most pertinent to you is the legal structure, the laws themselves and the government, and think about those, with in each case.
Samar Azazi wants to ask something. Samar, can you go ahead?
Yeah, I'm there. Hello, can you hear my voice?
Yes, we can. You're audible.
Okay, thank you. Hi, ma'am. My name is Samar. I am from Yemen. I was doing my BG in Women Studies, and during my study, I was reading about your essay, Recasting a Woman. So I am from Yemen, and today I am doing PhD in the School of Gandhi and Todd Universities in Mahatma Gandhi University. It's great honor for me to meet you, because as someone who was always reading your work, then today I meet you. It's really I'm feeling happy to see you. Ma'am, please, regarding for today about some questions on structure for violence. My question to you is that my background is about Middle East, and when I read today about structure of violence in India, I think just because of the caste, class, gender, it's all mixing together. But ma'am, in Middle East, we have this violence is because of custom, for traditional and customs, because it's not working that the man being good up than a woman, or they be, for example, in the same stage. So, ma'am, have you, from your experience, do you have any idea about how is the violence is in Middle East, or just your study just about South Asia and India? I mean, do you know about what is going on, or no?
Well, I think, this question of, women in the Middle East now
Mm,
have been writing fabulous novels, essays, articles, examining, the patriarchal conditions in their homes and the state.
they express about it. Yeah.
Absolutely. So this is like now as old as the women's movement in India. What's happening, what we've heard from Egyptian women, Moroccan women, and so on. So I don't have, some independent experience of the Middle East, except students whom I have taught or some friends. And I would say that, the restriction, the patriarchal restriction there is very much centered on control of sexuality. And that means prohibitions of entering the public sphere, of certain jobs,
Yeah.
and entering the job market. And generally, it's also about maintaining a public image.
Yes. True.
Because many of the women I've met, from Saudi and other places, have almost like two personalities, one
Yes.
presented to the public and one.
Yes. One in home. Yes.
So it's a complex situation like everywhere else, and it has its own particular, but also it is accompanied in some places with very grotesque punishments for infringement. And which is, we have honor killings in South Asia, so this is not particular to the Middle East.
Yes.
But the actual shape can be different.
Yes. Yes. Okay, ma'am. One more question. Do you think what is the source of violence?
Sorry?
What is the source of violence? Violence. What
Source
is
of violence.
source of violence itself?
What's
The
the source of
discourse
violence?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
The discourse of violence.
No. She wants to know the source of violence. What is
Oh
the
my
source?
God.
Yes. I mean, from your experience, from
I completely reject the idea that human beings are instinctively violent. If human beings have learned how to be socialized, they can also learn how to be non-violent. And this is, this has been, I am totally committed to non-violence. I don't care who is doing it, why they are doing it, but just stop.
yeah.
I don't think violence. I think an outright rejection of violence by feminists. I don't care what it's saving, what it's destroying. No violence. Because as one of the people that I am most conversant with is Gandhi, who said one act of violence will breed 20 more. It doesn't stop. It sets up a cycle. And we know that from the communal violence, and how it keeps coming back. We know that. In some sense, violence is intergenerational, Violence on the parents begets, other problems with the children.
Yeah.
And we've seen that in Iraq. We've seen it in so many places. It's destroyed the lives of the young in so many places for things that never happened to them but happened to their parents. So I think, I don't care what the source is, I don't particularly want to go into psychology or, um, the subconscious or the primal behavior of humans in, some millenniums ago. I don't see the point. Now, in the present, in this world, they can learn to be nonviolent.
Thank you.
Okay, there is one question by Indu Kumari. She says, now that spaces of resistance have shrunk across the world, how would you suggest that the resistance to structural violence can exist in the current moment, especially when you have mentioned that there are no consolidations of resistance happening? Marginalized groups have different sets of issues, hence solidarities suffer too.
Hence what?
Solidarities suffer too. Solidarities, yeah.
No, I agree with Indu Kumari. This is a bad time. There's no denying it. I mean, I think that, the spaces have shrunk. The places for free speech have shrunk and become more dangerous or just inaccessible or pushed to the margins. All of that is happening. But I also feel that there is no generation which has come after us which has not protested, in its own way. I don't think we have had some kind of, abject scenario of consent to everybody. So the means of protest might change, the direction might change, the language might change, This is the burden of, younger generations. They have to figure this out. What works? What can be done at a given time and place? What can't? What will have to be done tomorrow? Can't be done today or maybe later. These are all tactical, strategic questions which each generation will have to find its way through. And I don't think there's a prescription here. The prescription is to look at the past, look at the previous generations. They have never stopped. They have gone on. So will you. I have complete faith in that. I know things are hard. They can get harder. They can get really bleak. But so what? Things will change. They'll keep changing. Sometimes things change in a cataclysmic way. Sometimes they change slowly, There's so many different temporalities of struggle and change. Sometimes, the best you can do is to just talk to people.
Okay. Any more questions do we have? Okay, so I guess there are no more questions. I would just thank you for that brilliant talk, Professor Sangari. It was an honor to have you. And I would like to thank Professor M.H. Ilyas, Director of School of Gender Studies, MG University, Kerala, and all the faculty members of SGS, and also my colleagues at MWF for, helping me organize this, and also the audience, our generous audience, and for those insightful questions. Thank you once again.
Well, in closing, I would just actually want to say that perhaps one of the best things we can do is to try and stay in place. Hang on to the place we have and the place we have made as long as we can. Because sometimes, modest ambitions can create successes also. It's not always the ones who, it's not always the militant means, really. Sometimes the quiet things. And for all of those of you who are lucky to be in universities as students or as teachers, you have a place that you can maintain with dignity and with resistance.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And Prakriti, would you send me
The recording?
Yeah.
Yes, I will. I will send you the recording.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you very much, both of you. Lovely to see you again.
Same here, ma'am. Thank you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Kumkum. I would, yes, I'm going to get back to you. I hope you're going to be around for a few days more.
Yeah, what is it that you want to get to?
No, I mean, we were to catch up, but somehow
We were to
various.
catch. Actually, you know, Vasanti, can we postpone that to May?
Sure.
Because I have a family illness that
Yeah,
I'm dealing.
I know.
So a little bit further away will be easier.
Sure.
And
It
yeah,
was
nice to
great.
see you today. It's nice to see you today.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was good listening to you after. Well, I hadn't really listened to you as such. I've only read you, so it was good to listen to you.
I hope it was coherent.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.